Welcome to Groundbreaking, where consulting meets innovation.
Welcome back to Groundbreaking, where consulting meets innovation. My name is Jad Suba.
And I'm Peter Nabhan. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, Jad and I work for an engineering consulting company called ECS. And Groundbreaking is actually our new podcast that's geared towards the architecture, engineering, and construction industry, which for short we call the AEC industry. Our goal of this podcast is to bring on thought leaders within the space for them to share experiences and knowledge with each and every one.
Today, we are talking about brownfields and how their redevelopment has become relevant to our communities. But first, let's give a quick introduction to all of our thought leaders today. Today, we have Jason Beck. Jason is a principal geologist for ECS, specializing in environmental subsurface characterizations and remediation projects, including large-scale petroleum investigations and brownfield site assessments. He is a professional geologist and West Virginia licensed remediation specialist with extensive experience managing complex environmental site characterizations and remediation system designs. Jason, thanks for being on today. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
We also have our guest, George Carrico and Carrie Staten. George has been the environmental manager at Marshall University's Center for Environmental, Geotechnical, and Applied Sciences since 1996. He leads research and development, environmental management, energy development, and flood recovery. He has also served as a project manager since 2005 and director since 2013 of the West Virginia Brownfield Assistance Center, focusing on redevelopment of brownfield properties across West Virginia. Carrie Staten is the director of Northern West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center at West Virginia University and a coordinating lead for Mid-Atlantic TAB, providing strategic direction for the center's programs and partnerships. She has published research on brownfield redevelopment and presented at national and international conferences, holding degrees in nonprofit administration from Bethany College and public administration from West Virginia University. George and Carrie, thank you for being with us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Welcome to Groundbreaking. And we can't leave out Chuck. So last but certainly not least, we have Chuck Whipple. Chuck is the ECS Vice President and Director of Business Development and brings 43 years of experience in economic development and finance, having held key roles such as Chairman of the Southern Economic Development Council and advisory member to the U.S. Department of Commerce on foreign direct investment. He also serves as adjunct faculty at the University of Oklahoma Economic Development Institute, contributing to the education of industry professionals. Chuck, thanks for being here as another one of our ECS representatives today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, happy to have everyone today. Today we're talking, obviously, we're talking today about brownfields. So I really want to start with the basics, just explaining to our listeners. I think I'm going to start with you, Jason. Are you able to explain to us what is, simple terms, what is a brownfield?
Yeah, sure, Peter, no problem. Yeah, basically a brownfields is any property where the redevelopment of that site is challenged by the presence of contamination, either in the form of subsurface contamination, asbestos, or something. And a lot of people will ask, what's a brownfield? It's pretty much any property that's ever been touched by human hands has the potential to be a brownfields, because you can have contamination of all different sorts, and it really hinders redevelopment of the property. And you can find brownfields in small communities across the U.S. You can find them in big cities. It's a mixed bag of different types of properties. You can have a church that was a brownfields for an oil release or asbestos, or you can have a former school. We all know gas stations are big polluters, dry cleaners, things like that. But there's a multitude of different types of sites that can be considered brownfields.
I mean, that's a lot of places we have brownfields. I really want to hear I appreciate you sharing that simple explanation. And for you, Carrie and George, how do you define a brownfield in simple terms? And obviously I want to hear from you, Chuck, afterwards.
Well, everything that Jason just said is correct. I would add to that you also have that perceived contamination factor as well. It may or may not be a project or a site that's got any contamination on it. Just the fact that it could be there makes it a brownfield. And then we also have those, what we call unknown sites. We don't know what used to be there. So now you have that factor. Those are until you can figure it out, those are defined as brownfields. And yes, they can be located everywhere where he said, and in all across rural Appalachia, we've got them there too. And and Carrie smiled when you said it, but I use this. I say, if man has spent any time on a site, it's potentially a brownfield.
Yes. I was going to say, Jason stole that from you, I think.
I learned from the best. What can you say?
That's great. Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add is that they can be, as we're saying, they can be all these things, which means they can be as tiny as a little gas station that's, a quarter of an acre, or as big as a thousands of acre abandoned mine land, right? So they're any range of things. So they are everywhere and complex every time.
Yeah, so a brownfield could be the property next to your townhouse, for example.
Not to scare anyone, but
not to scare anyone, right?
That is correct.
Chuck, what do you think?
I mean, from an economic development perspective, typically there is some sort of a recognized source that would have identified a site or property, as a brownfield, and that's the first notice for us that there may be an issue with the site.
Yeah, I guess it's one of those things that you never really think about. You see those abandoned properties, in so many different places, whether it's a big city, small city. I mean, you never really think that there could be something impacting it, and that's why it's just kind of sitting there. So, I mean, with that, and this one's we're throw it over to Carrie and George again. What are some of those health risks that are associated with brownfields? Because obviously, one of the things that got brought up was, it could have been a former gas station for all we know. So what would those health risks be that people should be aware of when dealing with these properties?
Well, I'll start with a couple, and then Carrie can add a few more, I guess. When you're talking about buildings that are going to get rehabilitated, the biggest factors are your asbestos, lead-based paint, and mold issues. All of those have significant health factors associated with them. Asbestos, asbestosis, lead paint, especially with children, and of course mold and allergy sufferers like me, that can cause a lot of alarm there. And then all across the board, like on the petroleum side with gas stations and bulk plants, many of those compounds that you find, like benzene, those are carcinogenic. So, and then all the other things you have out there, many carcinogenic, and altogether, it's just that whole hodgepodge of health issues that are potentially associated with a brownfield, as you said, that could be right next door to where someone else has got something, where they're living or their business or whatever the case might be. Carrie, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it certainly depends on the kinds of contamination, but certainly there are different kinds of cancer. And I think the real concern around that is that these tend to be located in places that have higher concentrations also of vulnerable populations, young kids and the elderly, poor. And so there's a larger threat, right? They're already susceptible to those in other ways. And so that's what makes it really a big concern.
And if I could add one extra comment to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why conducting that phase 1 environmental site assessment is so important. And I promise you, the day I retire, that will be my farewell speech, is you better get a phase 1 done first. Carrie actually had shirts made up that says, "Have you had a phase 1 done?" We really stress that a great deal with everybody that we work with.
I mean, there's a lot of things, obviously, now, here in this list of, what could potentially be harmful to anybody that could be near it. So, I mean, and this one's getting thrown out to anyone. So, whoever wants to answer, feel free. So what are some of the most common solutions for brownfields? What does that process look like? Or, is there a specific, like a one size fits all remedy to everything?
Yeah, I think I'll start with just the more general, because I'm not the environmental scientist. I'm the community engagement. But I think there isn't a one size fits all is the first answer. But what's important is that it's all about risk. It's risk based, right? And so at the beginning, before there were the regulations that we have now, it was impossible to know how clean it needed to be and financially infeasible, right, to remove all of the contamination at the site almost always. So there have been since then established these risk-based cleanup standards. So it depends on how much time you're spending there, right? So when we're talking about these health issues and there might be a brownfield next door, the reason not to be scared is that doesn't mean that you're if you're living next door to a brownfield at this moment, you are currently being actively exposed. It's about how much time you're spending on that site, right? So if it's going to be residential, you're going to be there for a long time. There may be one strategy. If it's going to go to another industrial use, and so people aren't going to be on there as much, it's going to be a different strategy. And so I think that that's a really important piece. And I'll let the technical folks like George and Jason jump in with more details about that.
Yeah. I mean, I'll add something to that really fast. So there's no one size fits all for a brownfield site. It really is dependent on what is the current use and what is the future use, intended use of the property, and then you can mitigate the risk accordingly around it. Brownfield shouldn't scare people off. You can clean up. There have been, radioactive brownfield sites where there have been buildings built on top of them, and as long as you engineer and mitigate around it, you can do that. There's effective remedies for everything. Mm-hmm.
And I would add that, like here in West Virginia with our state program, and in many other states, you have these voluntary programs, voluntary remediation programs that are set up, and they do the exact same thing. What's the future intent of that site? What's it going to be used for? If it's recreational, or is it residential, or is it commercial? And then from that, you backtrack that into how much cleanup needs to be done in order to make it safe for that future use.
Good deal. Excellent. So I guess I'll take what you said, and I heard the term, obviously, cleanup, remediation. Jason, you mentioned that you can even put a building on top of it. Would you mind just, I think for the experts on the call, would you mind just walking us through some of the common techniques that you've used in the past to remediate some of these sites?
Yeah, I can take that and kind of run through some of it. So it largely depends on the type of contaminants. And, we're living in the age of emerging contaminants right now, where we have the trigger words right now, the PFAS, the Gen X chemicals, things of that nature. And we're learning, and the EPA is putting out new regulations associated with them daily. So you have to take all that into consideration on these historic sites as well now at this point, because it's kind of changing the game on what the remediation approach is. But oftentimes, if it's volatile organic compounds, something of that nature, you simply put a vapor barrier beneath the building with, your standard home radon system, maybe beefed up a little bit. You'll have a passive and an active vapor mitigation system to protect the inhabitants of the buildings, the future residents or commercial workers or what have you. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's just the remediation is as simple as just moving soil from one side of the property to the other and putting a cap and berm in place. So it really does vary. But, George brought up a really good point about the state voluntary program. So if you have a more complicated site where it warrants a little bit of additional regulatory oversight, you can enroll in the voluntary program, and they can help guide your environmental professional, help guide, work with your environmental team to get the site to a safe and healthy reuse.
I was just going to add that it goes back to the previous question we were talking about that future site usage. Once you know what you plan to put on the site, then it may be a matter of simply adjusting some of your site features. You put the parking lot on the east end of the property instead of the west end, if it'll fit. And that parking lot it is a cap, but the public sees it as a parking lot. So it serves that purpose. And then as Jason said, sometimes you can just manage these things in place with certain mitigation tactics. And sometimes you do have to do a little dig and haul or asbestos abatement or encapsulate some lead paint and some of those kinds of things. So it is site specific. There's never a one size fits all in the brownfields arena. That's for sure.
Absolutely. So from what you're saying, I heard there's a lot of ways where we can mitigate the existence of these brownfields through either proper design or encapsulation, or maybe moving dirt from one side of the site to another site. So we do have some ways at our disposal. But while you're doing implementation, I start thinking about what are some of the risks that you've seen.
I mean, we've seen a lot of some pretty crazy stuff. I mean, I've seen brownfields. We started digging on that, and we started finding underground storage tanks full of what were called Stoddard solvents. Stoddard solvents haven't been used since the turn of the century, essentially, and the tanks were still full. And it was we had straight hazardous soil down to 35 feet below ground. So that was by far my war story. I spent more time out at that job site than I care to admit, and it was rough. But they're not all that way, so I don't want to scare anyone.
And you can even have small sites that have very unique problems that are really hard to address. Just one I'll give you is I was asked to stop at a house and stop there and talk to folks. Found out that back in the 1940s, 1950s, it had been a little tiny gas station. The property had been sold. Somebody came in. Ultimately, they basically took the little building that was there, added on to it in various directions, and made a house out of it. And the house was actually a pretty nice house. I went inside their house, and in a closet, they had a little floor panel that they opened up and showed me a fill spout for an underground storage tank that was under their house. So that had to be obviously left in place, and we had people go in and cut a hole in the tank, go in, degas it, clean it, and then it was filled with a concrete slurry, and that was inside of a residence. So you never know what you might get into in the Brownfields arena, and that's one of many. Yeah, that's one of many.
Yeah, it's you can kind of see anything then, it sounds like. I mean, and obviously there's always the time invested into these projects, but then also, the money as well. But then you do hear about the upsides that come from these projects. So Chuck, I'm going to throw it over to you for this one. But if anybody wants to chime in, feel free. How does the redevelopment of brownfields in local communities really affect that community and their economy?
Sure. Redevelopment of brownfield sites accomplishes several things. One, it can increase the property value of sites that are adjacent to a brownfield or near a rehabilitated site, in as much to 10, 12, 15%, and perhaps more, depending upon the location in the area that's being addressed. Another benefit is the higher tax revenue due to the reassessed value of a redeveloped site. Typically, if a site's contaminated, then the assessed value is lowered somewhat just because the building may not be in use or the risk associated with that development. But once it's been cleaned up and redeveloped, then the opportunity for the local community to reassess that facility and assess it at a normal rate provides additional revenue for them to use across the board. The other thing basically is job loss in a community that has a brownfield building associated with it from an industrial perspective. When a site is contaminated and or closed, then those jobs are lost, right? In order to create an advantage for a community, that facility has to be rehabilitated. And they're not just normal construction jobs that go in to rehabilitate these facilities. To Jason's point, these are specialists that have to come in to rehabilitate most of these structures. And so they're jobs that are created as a result of that. Additionally, once the redevelopment occurs, then the long-term sustainable jobs associate with that development create opportunities for the folk that live, work, and play in that community. And I guess lastly, I would say, blighted, abandoned, unlikely structures tend to characterize a community or an area as unsafe. Typically, abandoned buildings are targets for vandals who are looking to strip out some of the commodities associated with the building, such as copper. Redeveloping these structures removes the stigma associated with these areas that they do foster criminal activity, thereby making the communities appear somewhat safer.
So they can be massively beneficial ultimately, which is it's great to hear. that it
Absolutely.
can really help revitalize a community that, might have something going on, like an issue like with lots of brownfields. So it's good to hear.
But in addition to those economic benefits, which are crucial, and the environmental benefits that we've talked about, I think when you're reusing these sites, it helps to combat urban sprawl, right? So you're not continuing to grow out. It can help preserve that green space. In a place like West Virginia, it might be the only option for development, right? Where our topography really limits the number of developable sites that are available. And so there's a real benefit to that and to attracting industry to sites that you already know are going to work because they've already got the infrastructure there. There was a factory there for 85 years. And now it's time for something else. And I think that in addition to reducing that stigma, there's the increased pride in community, right? And the increased livability and quality of life.
Getting into it then, and this one, Chuck, Carrie, whoever, feel free to hop in. You know, with certain things, obviously there can be two sides to every story, right? Is there any sort of opposition to these types of projects? And what is it if there is any?
I mean, we've seen instances where there are certain groups that do appear and they do challenge the redevelopment of a Brownsfield site because they, determine that, it could unearth VOCs that's associated with that project, creating, a human health hazard or a threat to the environment. So we've had groups approach us when we're looking to rehabilitate sites or buildings with those concerns.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when these sites have sat vacant for so long, for 30, 40 years, the the myth of and the sort of lore around what could be there can take on a life of its own, right? And so there can be an expectation that the contamination is a whole lot worse than it is. I mean, I've seen that. I'm sure George has seen that. I've been in a community. I have very vivid memories of a community meeting where they just didn't believe that it had been tested more than any site is normally tested. And they kept saying, you didn't go far enough. You didn't test enough. It's dirty, I promise. And it was dirty, but it wasn't anywhere nearly as dirty as anybody, including DEP, thought it was going to be. But the science was the science. But when you've spent the last 30 years of your life thinking that's a terrible place, don't go there, it's dangerous, and it's just those things can be hard to overcome in that moment for sure. And I'm sure George has had those meetings too.
And I would add to sometimes you run into the issues with landowners and the responsible party issues that can sometimes go along with it. That can be problematic.
And I'll add in real quick too that there's an aspect of a lot of these too in the public engagement where people have expectations of what they want the property to be, what they want it to become, and those expectations also go against each other sometimes. And it almost hinders communities because they can't come to an agreement on what that property should be. And I think that's a challenge. And that's just part of hearing out the community and working with them and working with all the stakeholders to figure out what the best intended reuse of the property is.
That's a good point, Jason. And I like the fact that you've mentioned community because ultimately perception is reality. To your point, Carrie, people thinking this is a much dirtier site than it actually is. So no, that's a very good point. At the end of the day, it's a human decision to be made. We can do all the science, all the engineering here, but ultimately it's human beings making decisions. And you have to also manage that as well. So I wanna shift the conversation on to talking about a project that was a brownfield, was a highly contaminated site, and you were able to successfully remediate the site, and maybe you had a very good positive impact on the community. If there's a project that comes to mind that you're able to share, I'd love to hear from you.
I could spend the next couple of hours talking about successful projects Carrie and I've had the pleasure of working on. I'll name a couple, for example. One fire station in Huntington, West Virginia, is now it's brand new, state of the art. It was a former dry cleaner and gas station, both that had significant issues associated with it. And now that fire station is located in the community that didn't have one, so it's in that perfect location. Those are those sites you just can't help but kind of grin a little bit. And finally, Marshall University has a brand new baseball field that opened this spring. that is also on part of a former brownfield site. And that's a couple of many we could mention.
Very nice.
I mean, there've been a couple that I've been involved with, but there are a couple that I think are worth highlighting. One was in Greensboro, Georgia. It was a cotton mill in a community of 4,000. It was a Brownsville site. They went in and created loft apartments for low-income families whose income was 30,000 or less. So satisfied, a need in that community and brought a facility back online. Another was a historic courthouse in Lexington, Kentucky. The facility dated back to the 1800s, early 1900s, operated as a courthouse until 2002 and a museum until 2012. And they found hazardous materials and asbestos in the facility, and it closed. But the community wanted the building to be back online because it was the center focus of the downtown area. The building was 50,000 square feet, and now it has restaurants, a tourism center, office, and event space. And so people are now congregating back in downtown Lexington as a result of that redevelopment. And the poster child, in my opinion, and Carrie and the folks from West Virginia probably can speak to this better than I can, but it's a 1.5 mile corridor between Ransom and Charleston, West Virginia, that was awful. I mean, it had dilapidated manufacturing buildings, contaminated properties, and the leadership of both towns came together and said, we want to solve this. And over the last 10 years, as I understand it, academia, a civic center, and other buildings operate in that corridor. About $50 million has been spent across that corridor, and 500 jobs developed in that tiny corner of West Virginia, which is a really cool story. So, and there are dozens of other stories that the EPA have provided funds for over the years to rehabilitate sites across this country.
That's great stuff. I mean, we've it's kind of funny that you bring up the EPA, being a part of this, because obviously that's where a lot of this stuff is coming from as well. These projects, we've heard about quite a big spectrum, right? When it comes to time and money. And, if you're on the one end where it can be, rather expensive, we've heard that there are grants that assist with these types of projects. Where do you find out more information about that, and, apply for it maybe? Is there like specific places? Is it all handled through the EPA? Is it state, local, federal? Like, how does that all look?
So there are a lot of resources from EPA on the environmental side. There's funding. Folks can apply directly for money around assessment and planning work, which is interesting. There's a lot of planning activities you can do with EPA money. That's not what you might traditionally think of an environmental agency funding, but things like market feasibility, site analysis, other site analysis. But certainly the more traditional environmental site assessments can be funded by EPA grants. They also can be funded directly by EPA, sending out a contractor to do the work for maybe a community or potential nonprofit that doesn't have the capacity to apply for a grant. They also have funding for the remediation. Not everybody can apply for that money. Most grants, they are targeted to nonprofit organizations, public entities, quasi-governmental organizations. But there's a lot of resources. And the reason that the centers were started was to help communities in West Virginia with low capacity to access that money more effectively. And the TAB program that you mentioned that I am the lead in this region is the Technical Assistance to Brownfields program. And that's funded by EPA to help those communities learn more about brownfields, understand the whole process, but then also to help them figure out the resources. So those are the traditional ones. I would also say that there are a lot of other federal agencies that are funding brownfield projects that don't know that they are funding brownfield projects, right? So EPA will clean it up, but then you have to build the library. And so there are things like USDA that funds community facilities that build a library, and there's the EPA that might do help finance an industrial site, right? So there are a lot of resources from all of the angles.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too that there's also state resources depending on which state you're in. There are brownfields grants available in various states. Like Virginia has a revolving loan fund for brownfields grants. West Virginia has some state money available, things of that nature. So you can basically reach out to your state environmental regulatory
funds from a grant or finance perspective. They have a multi-purpose grant program, an assessment program. They fund revolving loan funds to assist with projects, and then they also have cleanup grants. And to date, EPA's leveraged probably close to $30 billion in cleanup and redevelopment dollars and created, almost 150,000 jobs across the U.S. So it's a good resource for those folk that are looking to determine, one, whether or not a building or a site may be contaminated, but then they can also help with the funding component of it as well.
We talked about sort of the challenges and why brownfields are good, why brownfields are hard, but they can be more expensive. It does take longer. And so those funding sources at the state or federal or other levels can help incentivize, right, the redevelopment of them as opposed to those green spaces or as opposed to some other sites that may be less complicated.
I think the last thing I'll add basically is that if you are tribal nation and have issues relative to brownfields or brownfields related sites, the EPA has a non-competitive program that targets tribal communities. So it's available for that population as well.
So there's plenty of public funding. Now, obviously we went through, there's the EPA and there's plenty of other, government organizations that are, you can apply for these grants through or funding through. Now, when it comes to more of the private sector side of that, how do you make brownfields attractive to them to help get them into these communities to, redevelop these sites?
By leveraging the federal dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's it.
Nice and easy.
But it's highly competitive, though. I'll add, though.
Yes.
I would add, though, that we have a lot of private developers that know, and let's be honest here, at the end of the day, they know they can make money off of brownfields. There are lots of them out there that see a brownfield and they don't think, oh my gosh, this is going to cost us a lot extra. They say, oh no, nobody else wants these sites, and we know we can get them redeveloped and be successful doing it. I was just thinking while you all were talking there, I can think of 3 projects right now in the area where I'm at near Marshall University, and all of them have, started off with a $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 worth of EPA grant assistance, and now there's a $30 million, a $44 million, and a $51 million project all in the works right now, and it all got started because of that. And those private developers are the ones who are behind it, knowing that at the end of the day, it's going to be a successful, profitable project.
Well, and across the economic development space, and across community, there's a lack of sites and there are a lack of available buildings. And so these brownfield sites, these buildings that, have some challenge or opportunity, absolutely for developers to take advantage of because of the limited number of resources that exist currently in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I think it gets a little more granular because it really depends on the site and where it is and what kind of site it is. But there are other tax incentives that are not brownfield specific, but if it's a historic building, then it may qualify for federal or state historic tax credits. There may be a TIF district, a tax increment financing district that would be eligible. There might be a new markets tax credit project that, and they want brownfields. They don't only do brownfields, but there's sort of a point, right, for doing a brownfield. And then there was many years ago before I got into this work, a federal brownfield specific tax incentive. And there is a push from the National Brownfields Coalition to bring that back. So they're looking at that. I think that was probably more successful. My understanding from reading about it was that it was more impactful in urban environments. It didn't really help make bridge that gap on these rural projects that George and I work on the most, but in some of those urban projects, fill the gap that let people get across the finish line to redevelop it.
One additional thing related to that is energy related projects are really, really hot right now. And the IRS has new brownfield related energy project credits that, solar industry, wind farms, things of that nature can move in on a brownfield side and get some significant tax help on that and not have to pay the same tax level that they would on if they were going into a greenfield side, basically virgin land in that sense. So I think they work hand in hand.
And I've heard you mention a lot of the different stakeholders that are part of this pursuit, essentially, are part of redeveloping a brownfield. And obviously, you've had to collaborate with a lot of them. But how would you describe maybe some of the successes in collaborating with different stakeholders, and as well as maybe some of the challenges?
Well, I'll start by saying that when you're using EPA brownfield grant dollars, you have to have that community component on board, right, in your application right from the start. So having the community groups, in addition to your state-related folks like our DEP here in West Virginia, in addition to your federal partners, all of them are equally important, quite frankly. If you don't have them on board, you really don't have a project. You've got to have that community aspect in particular. And also from the private sector, you've got to make sure you've got them on board as well with many projects. But it does go back to every site is its own unique project. And it's going to be always based on that and what you're wanting to accomplish on that particular site.
Oh, it's a fantastic point. Thank you. Thank you, George, for sharing. And I do want to, bring this more to a futuristic vision. It's 10 years from now. How do you see the future of brownfields evolving? And this is an open question for everybody.
I'll go first. I plan to be retired.
Okay.
I have anything to say about it.
However, people have been saying things like, wow, y'all been doing brownfields. So we're going to celebrate our 20th year in the brownfields arena next year. And, you've been doing this a long time. Have you ran out of sites yet? And I always respond with, we haven't even got started yet. There's so much more to do. And slowly but surely, people are realizing these properties have value and can be, again, redeveloped for new use.
I mean, I would think that's the biggest issue when you first, looked at Brownfield and Superfund sites. I mean, they were black eyes and nobody wanted to touch them, and they were a blight and a sore eye on the community. And now look at what's transformed, since the EPA started providing funding for Brownsfield, and they're more readily acceptable and developers are willing to take risk on them. So I think they will continue as long as, to somebody's point earlier, as long as humans are involved with sites, things are going to happen, and we're going to have sites that are going to be challenged, and folk will find a way to make them repurposed, for the lack of a better word.
Yep, absolutely. We definitely live on a finite amount of space on Earth. So anything that has been used up that can be reused, we should definitely look into it. Jason, were you? How do you see the future? I want to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this program's going to last a long time. I think we're going to continue to have brownfields, and I think people see the direct impact on the communities, big or small. You're not going to have a more impactful program. And if you walk into a dilapidated school that's been sitting there for 30, 40 years, no one's using, or a big industrial facility, and that gets converted into, like a senior housing facility or HUD development or something along those lines. I mean, we're converting industrial sites into low-income housing. They've been sitting. We have one site that's been sitting for over 50 years, hasn't been touched. And all of a sudden it's got life, it's got vibrancy back into it. And it's feeding the community again, because you see that industrial complex getting redeveloped And then all the neighboring properties are all of a sudden starting to get redeveloped as well. And the residences are getting redone. So it is a direct impact. And I can't think of another environmental program that has so much impact on the local community. And when you have something like that, people want to see it keep happening. So, and it's more or less, it's long since been bipartisan. Everyone loves it. So everyone.
I think that I would share that optimism, and I hope that the sort of federal and state investment stays at the level that it has been in recent years. But I think you're also seeing, I think the reason I share that optimism is because of what I said, that you're starting to see not EPA agencies investing in brownfields and now being more aware that they are, right? Community facilities has always been doing it from USDA, but now they're saying the word brownfields, right? Everybody is kind of getting more into the popular lexicon. And George is right. We're always making more, unfortunately, right? There are always going to be more brownfields, and there's still all the ones we have to deal with before the new ones that are getting made and the new industries, right? So they're not going anywhere, but they're also the opportunity that's at a brownfield is not going anywhere either.
Excellent. So it looks like we have a lot to be excited about. And I guess, wake up every day, every morning, you have a lot to do. George, maybe for the next 5 years, and everybody else for the next 10 or 20. I appreciate everything that you do. And I learned a lot today about brownfields. I don't know about you, Jad. How do you feel?
Yep. A lot more. I mean, we hear about it all the time at work, right? I mean, it's such a big thing nowadays. But me as, being a humble marketing professional, I don't know everything. So being on a call like this is absolutely enlightening. So I appreciate everybody for that.
Absolutely. And I do actually, so we're close to the ending, but I do want to finish us off with one question that we ask of everybody that comes to to our podcast. Are you okay answering that question?
True.
Cool. So the question is, can you tell us something in your life that has been groundbreaking?
Personal or professional? So, Jason, you want to start us off?
I'll start us off. So groundbreaking, Peter, is that what you're saying? Like something that's earth-shattering, changed everything? Yeah.
I think I may know what you might share, Jason, but
adopting a kid was groundbreaking. Completely changed our lives forever. Yeah. So that's mine.
Love it. Carrie, up next.
So mine is more professional, but when I started the Brownfield Center in 2011, I was the only woman on our staff, and this brownfields are kind of at the intersection of some very male-dominated fields. And so in 2017 in West Virginia, we started the Women in Brownfields, which is just a breakfast that we do at our conference every year. At first, we just wanted to find the other women that are working in the field and then to sort of share and build each other up. And it is going strong. We have it every year. Pennsylvania started stealing it from us. The national conference started stealing it from us. So it's one of my favorite parts of the year, and also something that I'm just really proud of.
Great stuff.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Chuck?
We referenced one of the federal programs earlier that's used to often facilitate the development of brownfields, but in the early 1990s, I worked on a transaction that was really one of the first of its kind across the U.S., and that was the securitization of a community development block grant loan program. We used CDBG funds to finance industries in the rural parts of South Carolina. And so we were a local intermediary, and we needed to raise additional dollars. So we securitized the existing portfolio that we had at the time to raise money for additional transactions to CDBG eligible communities, and was one of the first that was done in the country. So exciting times back then.
Awesome. George, last but certainly not least, and I know you haven't quite hit retirement yet, but because I know that will be groundbreaking for you, but what you got, sir?
I got one a lot better than that, actually. I'm getting ready to celebrate here in the next couple of days 35 years of marriage to my first wife. She can't get rid of me if she wanted to.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
That's amazing.
Great stuff, guys. Once again, just thank you to all of you for being here with us today to kind of, share your knowledge on these topics and your perspectives. It was very, like I said earlier, very enlightening for me, and I'm sure our listeners will also appreciate it as well. So to wrap up here, don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast.
Professional engineering services or used to establish the standard of care. This podcast and the comments contained therein represent only the personal views of the participants and do not reflect those of ECS. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors.